I watched a video called Porn Addictions by a very popular Christian YouTube user called Shield of the Sun. It was a 15-minute video and it was very highly rated. Lots and lots of thumbs up from his predominantly Christian subscriber base. And it really brought home to me just how many Christians just don't understand sex, don't understand it at all, and have terribly distorted attitudes about it. Now, his theme in particular for the video was pornography, but and we'll get to that in a moment. But I just listened to the video and I thought, my goodness, how do I untangle all of these wrong attitudes? He said that sexual desire was not wrong. Okay, he's got that right. But then in the next breath, it's assumed that masturbation is wrong. You know, if you have sexual desire and you're not married or not in a relationship of any kind, your only outlet to relieve that desire is masturbation. And yet he doesn't explain why masturbation is wrong. Even if you read the Bible, you know, it doesn't talk about this at all. There's just the occasional statement, and very few statements, that speak against sexual lust. There was, Jesus said, whoever looks at a woman to lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. And this would appear to be directed really at married men, because notice he doesn't say a fornication, he says adultery. He's talking about men, you know, whom it would have been assumed are married with wives, who shouldn't be desiring other women. He wasn't really making a blanket statement for all people that you must not lust. It's impossible not to, you know. We're hardwired for it, and contrary to what this YouTube user says, and presumably most of his subscribers seem to agree with him, that, you know, sexual lust comes from Satan. And masturbation, you know, all of this stuff is to do with the devil working on you. Such a load of nonsense. Do you realize that your sexuality is an exact mirror of sexuality in the rest of the animal kingdom? We reproduce just like the rest of the animals reproduce. The only thing that's different about us is that our brain, which is highly developed, makes the whole mating ritual much more complicated. So we've got marriage institutions and all kinds of rules and regulations and whatnot that you don't see in the animal kingdom, but you see all the other behaviors, you know. The peacock will strut its feathers just like you know, the human female and even the male will seek to put out mating signals by the way that they dress and by their posture and everything. So it's just the same. How do you turn this into a sin? Now, I'm saying this and it seems so rational to me, and hopefully you agree I'm being rational about it here. But you know what? I did live through this nonsense. I became a Christian when I was 17, didn't understand sexuality, didn't understand myself, tried to make this whole holiness thing work, and it was just the worst thing ever. You know, I haven't had all that many relationships in my life, so I've been a single man for the most part. So you're basically, as a Christian, you're just trying to cope with this sexual desire that has nowhere to go, and everything you feel, you're just being made to feel ashamed of it. And it never occurs to you at the time. That's completely absurd. It's totally absurd. It makes no sense at all. And yet look at the countless Christians that are all wrapped up in their neuroses about sex, and they're just, if you're anything like the way I was, you kind of just wish you didn't have a sex drive, because there seems to be nothing you could do about it. You're stuck with it. You can't do anything with it. It would be better if you didn't have it. Now, this guy in the video actually went as far as saying that to be single is an unnatural position, and that you should find someone and get married. So he's basically, nobody really seriously advocates marrying very young. That's generally regarded as a bit foolish, that you should be a little older. You should even spend a few years possibly getting to know each other before you commit to marriage, because it's such a big deal. So I'm not sure what the average age that people marry is, but let's say it's in the early 20s or something like that. So this guy is basically taking people from sexual awakening at puberty, 12, 13, right through to 22. So for an entire decade, you're just hanging everybody out to dry. Deal with your sexuality. I got no answer for you. You're living an unnatural life. And this guy, all the little Christians came along. Thumbs up. Thank you, brother. Great advice, brother. No. Totally absurd. But you can't seem to see it. You're living in a way that's totally unnatural. It's totally unnatural to live in denial of your own sexuality. And I'm not advocating, a promiscuous lifestyle or anything like that. I'm just advocating the acceptance of the carnal side of yourself. That is not demonic, not sinful, completely natural. And the reason why it's so strong is because your evolutionary development, there's a big bad word for the Christians, isn't it? Evolution. It wants the species to survive. And we've got so good at beating disease and even natural disaster and all these other things that tended to claim, and predation from other species, all these things that claimed a lot of animal life. Animals have to reproduce so often because they're in such danger all the time. We've overcome that to a large extent, but we're still lumbered with this high sex drive that is far more powerful than anybody nowadays could ever really productively use it for, because there's just not so much death as there used to be back in the days where we were hunter-gatherers and where we were running away from dangerous predators in the wild. It isn't like that anymore. So I'm just trying to give you kind of a background to understanding sexuality. There's nothing wrong with it. Accept it. Enjoy it. I do. And it took a long time before I could. Now, let's move on now to this whole subject of pornography. I know a lot of people who are not Christians, like myself, tend to be very permissive about their attitude to pornography, but I do see something very amiss here. Now, in the most basic sense, pornography exists because unfulfilled sexual desire exists. So in other words, your libido is there, it wants relieved. Therefore, you can either use your imagination or there's pornography. Now here's the problem. Visual eroticism, there's no real moral issue with that at all. I mean, when I was a kid, it was a different world. There was no internet. Access to anything visually erotic. It consisted of, one of those rare occasions when you might catch a sex scene in a late night movie, which was very tame, because it wasn't real porn, But and then there was, my mum had these mail order catalogs. There was the Kay's catalogue and the Littlewoods catalogue, and you could buy everything from these things. They were about that thick. But they had like a swimsuit and a lingerie section, and so curiosity, teenage curiosity. So these were basically the pornographic magazines of my youth. And you guys who are over 40, some of you probably remember this too and had similar experiences. Now today, it's very, very different for the young person. The internet gives you access to hardcore pornography of all kinds. And I'm not just talking about, you know, regular sex. I'm not even talking about, you know, I'm not against pleasurable forms of creativity or whatever, not at all. But I don't want to be descriptive about this because I know there are people who are sensitive, so I'm not going to be descriptive. But listen, pornography, for the most part, is about treating a woman like a human ashtray. It really is. And is that how you see sex? Is that how you want to see sex? The best example I know of about what I'm talking about here and about why pornography is dangerous, I caught this interview with a psychologist called Jesse Bering. And the interview was on the Festival of Dangerous Ideas 2012. That's where I found it from. You can look this up on YouTube, that's where I found it. And he was talking about what he termed paraphilia, P-A-R-A, paraphilia. And this is where you develop some kind of sexual fascination for something that, instead of having like a wide variety of things, of things about women that can stimulate you sexually, it's very, very narrow, very fetishistically narrow. And he quoted this really tragic example of this kid whose first experiences of masturbation, they happened as a result of him not finding a mail order catalogue, but finding his dad's, this medical book of his dad's. And his dad was a doctor. And this book contained photographs of naked women who were victims of something or other that caused them to be amputees. They had either a leg missing or part of an arm missing. So this kid found this. And remember, this is his first experiences of seeing naked women. Now, obviously, no one in their right mind is attracted to the idea of an arm being cut off. But if you're a young kid and you see these pictures and you feel the erotic stimulation of just the womanliness that is in these pictures, as you're supposed to feel that, right? The general curviness of the woman. And you then masturbate to these images. What happens in the unconscious mind is that the unconscious mind, being incapable of any kind of judgment, it associates the two things together. So his mind then created this association between the amputations and the general sexuality of the woman. They became fused in this kid's appreciation of sex. So from that point on, it probably took repeated experiences for this to become crystallized like this. But from that point on, he was only really stimulated by women who had the feature of having an amputated limb. Now you can laugh at that and think it's funny or think it's really sick, but you know, try to be dispassionate about this. This happened entirely by accident. This is exactly the same kind of accident that happens when you have a negative experience to do with something else that creates a phobia. I met someone who had a phobia about clocks. Couldn't stand analog clocks. Sounds absurd, but obviously her mind at some point had created some kind of association between the clock and another experience that generated fear. And so every time she saw a clock, the fear response was triggered. So now in this guy's case, every time he sees an amputee, the sexual response is triggered. So it's got nothing to do with Satan, it's got nothing to do with sin. It's just, he made a bad decision that caused his sexuality to become distorted in a way that was detrimental to him, really. And he ended up having to live with a lot of feelings of shame and everything. And the story goes on in that he actually married a woman who was an amputee, and she ended up finding pornography on his computer of amputees, and she divorced him because she felt deceived. She hadn't known that he had this particular fetish. She felt deceived about it and divorced him. There's nothing terribly evil about this guy, is there? Not really. He's just an ordinary guy with a bit of an issue that he developed quite by accident because he didn't really know any better. Now, what has this got to do with pornography in general? What you see generally in pornography, and I don't recommend that you see it at all actually, is very distorted portrayals of women and sex acts and things that are done to women. So, just like that kid, indulgence is going to create associations in the mind where you will find things sexually appealing that ordinarily would not be sexually appealing, because pornographers always trying to push the envelope, to play on an addict's need to constantly re-energize something that's getting less and less interesting, because the more, like any drug user, the more you indulge in something, the less interesting it becomes, and the greater dosage you need. So you've got pornographers thinking along those lines, and that's why pornography is quite often extreme. And there's a lot of sick stuff out there, and it's perfectly accessible to anyone of any age. And there are some pretty alarming statistics in that most kids have accessed it from a very young age, and we're talking about 11 or 12 here, maybe even younger. So honestly, I look back to my childhood and I am glad I got to grow up in a different era, because I'm of an age where I can actually talk about this and actually make the comparison and show people, hey, it wasn't like this in the 1980s. When I think of what a kid faces today, a kid's maybe 12 years old, doesn't understand himself, he's experiencing his awakening sexuality for the first time, he's curious about pornography, he starts to look it up on the internet, he finds the hardcore stuff, the stuff that's strange, he starts indulging in it, he gets excited by it, all kinds of associations are now being made in the mind, and he basically, before he's even had a chance to understand sexuality in any kind of healthy way, he's growing up through his teenage years with a totally distorted view of sex. Gosh, young people have just got to be made so aware of the dangers, and made aware in such a way that it actually doesn't provoke them to want to look at this stuff. Because sexuality is one of those things where the more you make it forbidden, the more alluring it becomes. So you can't go down that road of I don't know, I don't have a good answer here. I just see that the world at the moment, Western society with its sex mad attitudes, there's just a state of sexual crisis, put it that way. The world is in a state of sexual crisis. And maybe you don't agree with me, but I want you to be very honest with yourself, and ask yourself, maybe the reason you don't agree with me, maybe the reason is because you want to indulge in pornography, because you've been indulging in it and you haven't been able to stop indulging in it, and you think that if I put you in this position, then I'm putting you back into a state of guilt that you don't want to go back to. Nothing of the kind, I would never want to go back to the kind of attitudes towards sex that I had as a Christian, where I tried to be holy and pure in a way that was just unrealistic and inhuman, and created more problems for me than it ever solved. So that's certainly not the answer, but I think, funnily enough, the best answer I have to this whole thing comes from something that Anton LaVey said. Anton LaVey, funnily enough, being the founder of the Church of Satan, of all things. Anton LaVey was all about understanding the carnal side of man's nature, and he had a lot of very wise things to say. And one of the principles was indulgence, not compulsion. And Satanism doesn't necessarily stand for, an anti-pornography stance or anything, but it's this idea that accept the carnal part of your life, indulge it, enjoy it, but do not let it go down the road of compulsion. And we understand this so easily in other aspects of life, such as food. We enjoy our food, but we all know that to be a compulsive eater is going to make you obese and unhealthy, and actually, you can risk your life. You can get so obese that you risk your life. So take a little of that wisdom and bring it over into the arena of sexuality. Enjoy your sexuality, but know when to prevent it becoming an obsession. And pornographers are out to get you more and more obsessional about sex. And it's madness. It's absolute madness. So I'm not saying you should never look at an erotic image or anything like that, never enjoy anything like that, never masturbate. I'm not saying any of these things. I'm just saying be aware that there's a whole industry out there that is out to absolutely destroy your mind for its own profit. So we'll see how this video goes down.